السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. محاضرتنا اليوم the last lecture of the abdomen, the perineum. What is the perineum? The perineum is a part of the pelvic cavity below the pelvic diaphragm. The perineum is a diamond in shape and is bounded anteriorly by the symphysis pubis, posteriorly by the tip of the coccyx, and laterally by the right and left ischial tuberosities. The perineum, it is divided by the imaginary line between the ischial tuberosities into anterior urogenital triangle and posterior anal triangle. As I said, the perineum is divided by the imaginary line between the ischial tuberosities into anterior urogenital triangle and posterior anal triangles. The anatomical border of the perineum are anteriorly is the pubic symphysis, posteriorly the tip of the coccyx, and laterally the inferior pubic rami and inferior ischial rami and the sacrotuberous ligaments. The roof of the perineum is formed by the pelvic floor or the pelvic diaphragm, and the base of the perineum is formed by the skin and fascia. And you can see in this picture the imaginary line between the two ischial tuberosities which divide the perineum to the urogenital triangle anteriorly and the anal triangle posteriorly. A urogenital triangle also, it is divided by the perineal membrane in two parts, which is called the superficial perineal bulge and deep perineal bulge. First, the superficial perineal bulge, it is a potential space between the perineal membrane superiorly and the superficial perineal fascia inferior. And what is the content of the superficial perineal bulge? First, so it is called the ischiocavernosus, which maintain the glottal erection. Second, the pubocavernosus contributed to the release of the secretion from the Bartholin glands. Third, the superficial transverse perineal muscle, which is contribute to the perineal body. And as I said, the Bartholin gland, vestibular bulbs, the glytorus, and the branches of the pudendal vessels, which means the artery and vein, and pudendal nerve. Also, urethra and vagina traverse this space. Second part from the urogenital triangle is the deep perineal bulge. And the deep perineal bulge is a potential space between the deep fascia of the pelvic floor superiorly and the perineal membrane inferior. and the contents of the deep perineal bulge. First is the compressor urethrovaginal sphincter muscle in the female, external urethral sphincter, part of the urethra and the vagina, branches of the internal pudendal artery, and dorsal nerve and vein of the clitoris. These are the content of the deep perineal bulge. And the second part, which is the posterior anal triangle, the anal triangle is posterior half of the perineum. It is bounded by the coccyx and sacrotuberous ligament and theoretical line between the ischial tuberosities, as I said before. The main content of the anal triangle are the anal apparatus, means the opening of the anus, external anal sphincter muscle, which is the voluntary muscle responsible for the opening and closing the anus, and the last part, which is what's called the anal fossa, which is, I mentioned this fossa in the previous lecture. I talk about the ischiorectal fossa in the previous lecture, in the second lecture of the pelvis. Also, I mentioned the content of this fossa. And important thing also mentioned before in the previous lecture, which is called the external sphincter. External sphincter can be divided into three parts. First, superficial cutaneous part, which is encircles the lower end of the anal canal and has no bony attachment. This is the first part of the external sphincter. The second part, the superficial part, which is attached to the coccyx, it means attached to the bone behind and perineal body in the front. So there is a bony attachment for this part. The third part, which is deep part, which is encircle the upper end of the anal canal, has no bony attachments. The other part, which is called 𝗣𝗘𝗟𝗑𝗬 fiber of the two levator ani muscle from each side, right to left, blend with the deep part of the external sphincter. The anorectal ring consists of the internal sphincter, deep part of the external anal sphincter, and 𝗣𝗘𝗟𝗑𝗬 muscles. This anorectal ring, which felt on rectal examination. During rectal examination, you can feel the anorectal ring. And you can see in this picture the all part of the external sphincter. And the last thing which I mentioned, it's before the male genital organ in the previous lecture. And thank you very much.